I think we were a little shocked about the way in which maybe it had changed from the 80s and early 90s to, about 2015 when we moved back to see how pervasive the idols of suburbia had become.
Well, welcome back to the Living Sent podcast. I'm your host, Justin Wester, and I am so glad that you are tuning into today's episode. I know it is going to encourage you, and depending on where you call home, is probably going to challenge you on some things in a very good way as well. Hey, if you're new to the podcast, let me share a little bit about it with you. I release a new episode on the first Wednesday of each month with the goal of helping you live like an everyday missionary within the household, neighborhood, workplace, and city. And my promise to you is that I'm going to work crazy hard to bring you content that is valuable. And if you do find this episode or any other episode worthwhile, it would mean the world to me if you would rate and review this podcast wherever you are consuming it. You know, anytime I'm able to do an interview on this podcast, I consider it an absolute privilege. And on today's episode, I get a chance to interview Ashley Hales about one of her books called Finding Holy in the Suburbs. But even if you don't live within the suburbs right now, I know you're going to get a lot out of this because everything that she speaks about is transferable and it will help you live sent wherever you call home. So without further ado, my interview with Ashley Hales. All right, well, welcome back to the Living Sent podcast. I'm so excited because I have an opportunity to talk with Ashley Hales and tell you a little bit about Ashley before we jump into this. She holds a PhD in English literature from the University of Edinburgh, Scotland. And with her husband, she is the co-founder of the Willowbrae Institute. It's a new think tank researching the intersection of Christianity and the common good in America. And correct me if I'm wrong, but she's a Kirby Lang Center academic fellow and advisor to the board of Covenant College. And she also hosts the Cartographers podcast and is the author of a number of books, one of which we're going to talk about today. Finding Holy in the Suburbs, that's our one of interest, Spacious Life, and then you've got one coming out as well very soon called A Fruitful Life, which is based on the Sermon on the Mount. And she and her family live in the central coast of California. Did I miss anything?
I think that's pretty much more than is needed, but thank you.
Well, you have an absolute full schedule, I can imagine. But jumping in here, you didn't always live in the suburbs. That's the title of the book that we're going to talk about today, Finding Holy in the Suburbs. But you didn't always live there. So tell us a little bit, where did the book originate? Where were you before you moved there? And what kind of prompted this book in the first place?
Yeah, I grew up in the suburbs. My husband and I met in suburban America, and so that was kind of all we knew. And then in 2015, we moved from Salt Lake City, Utah, where we had been doing college ministry for several years, to plant a church back where we came from. So it's kind of the added challenge of both returning as an adult to where you grew up, as well as seeing what's changed in the suburban landscape. We also had several years in Edinburgh, Scotland for graduate work before we had children, and that felt like this vista of opportunity. So I think suburban life, we were looking forward to it. We understood it. We knew it. But I think we were a little shocked about the way in which maybe it had changed from the 80s and early 90s to, about 2015 when we moved back to see how pervasive the idols of suburbia had become.
Yeah. So when you moved there, like what if you had to land on one or two things, what would you say was that thing that shocked you most? Like what kind of gave you pause and what surprised you most when you moved back?
I think the busyness was ramped up as far as everyone taking their kids to everything and what they've called like snowplow parenting these days. And so that wasn't particularly unique. It had just kind of gone up to 11. I think what was really most fascinating was the kind of consumptive comparison. So, that the things that we acquire, whether it's a house or a vacation or even our bodies, almost feel like things that we acquire. And then there was this sense to always feel like you had to constantly improve them. Your house was no longer okay unless it had the latest remodel or you had taken the next killer vacation.
Right.
And so things got really outsized quite quickly.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned snowplow parenting. We're in
Mhm.
Florida. So is that the same thing as like helicopter parenting? I have
Well,
no idea what you're
helicopter,
talking about.
yeah, helicopter parenting, right? You're hovering over
Yeah.
your kid, right? Snowplow parenting is like, I'm going to go before you and clear away, and
Ah,
take out all the obstacles in your path. So,
okay. Thank you for clearing that up for the Floridians who are listening.
what
Um,
does a snowplow do again?
exactly. And what is snow? Yeah. I had a question about that. So like when you guys moved back, like were you and your husband tracking with each other? Like, was he experiencing the same things that you're describing in the book? And then, like, were your kids as well? Like, or did you feel like I'm on a deserted island all alone? What has happened?
Yeah. I think he was mostly excited about the vision and the opportunity of planting a church in that context. And one of our core values was beauty. And so there was a way in which we were trying to articulate, it's a beautiful place to live. There's beautiful people, there's beautiful things, but those things can only point to an ultimate beauty that is found in Jesus and then found in the gospel and then lived out amongst his people in the church. So he was really motivated. I think I felt a little isolated for sure. My
Sure.
youngest child at that point was maybe three, 2 or 3.
Okay.
Um, and so I was also in the thick of early years of parenting still. And, the people that I was meeting, there was just a few of them that we could talk about books and,
Right.
things that were more exciting than, yeah, the kitchen remodel.
Sure. Sure. And do you have 3 children or 4 children?
For,
Wow.
hmm
Okay. We do as well. So I know exactly what you're talking about.
yeah.
Well, I looked up online and found this number, and I think it kind of depends on where you look. And it said about half, or maybe slightly more than half, of Americans actually live currently in suburbs. And
hmm
so I know there's a couple people that pop into my mind. For them, they probably have not given like a second thought to how where they live might be shaping them.
For
So
sure.
if that person is listening, how might you bring them into this conversation for the very first time that, hey, where you live actually can shape you, it can form you. If they've never thought that way before, how would you introduce that idea to them and help them start to get their mind around that?
I wrote recently in an article, not about place particularly, but thinking about how it feels different to walk into a cozy living room of one of your best friends. You
Hmm.
don't really think about the mess, but you have a feeling of like, oh, I can relax and exhale versus, maybe what it feels like to wait in line at an airport, right? Where you just kind of feel you're shuffled in and you feel kind of anonymous. And so we can see that places from a warm, inviting living room with a relational attachment is a welcoming experience, right?
Hmm.
That we can really unfold versus, something that feels more corporate where you're just anonymous and everything is up to you to like hustle and make things work. And so you could think of suburban life, even though maybe it looks all very fancy on the outside, often in more affluent areas of the country. But it really is functionally moving us into that cattle car mentality. Like you have to keep up with the Joneses. If you don't grab your luggage, someone else is going to run over you. And there is this sense in which our places, without even thinking, because it's the water that we swim in, really shape us. And it's easy to get sucked into the values of a place. It's often why we choose to live, if we have that luxury, where we do. But to imagine like what sort of, and maybe a few questions could help. Like what are your neighbors' expectations of how you spend your time?
Hmm.
How often do you see your neighbors? Are people gathering in the front yard? Are they gathering in the backyard? Is neighborliness valued? Do you know people? Do you have people you could depend on? Or is this kind of a pull yourself up by your bootstraps sort of place? Other questions might be, what do people talk about? What do they default
Hmm.
to? Maybe it's just the accolades of their children. Maybe it's their promotion at work. Is this a place where you can actually talk about the things that matter or the things that are hard? And to begin to pay attention to what are the rhythms of a place and the routes of a place are ways to begin to unpack, how does my place affect how the things that I value and the things that I love?
And this isn't just isolated to the suburbs, right? I mean, like
For sure.
wherever you live, it in part at least shapes you somehow. And
Right.
so it's not just a suburban thing. It's any context.
Right.
Um,
And you get that, like I had a friend who recently was in New York City for a week and he was saying there's more dogs than children. And
yeah,
right,
yeah,
that becomes what we value.
right. So you, in your book, right out of the gate, you use the parable of the prodigal son or the parable of the lost son as kind of this analogy, and you keep coming back to it throughout the book, and I love that. Can you help listeners draw the connection between that parable and what you talk about in the book? Like you mentioned at the very beginning, how this parable has a lot of like themes of hunger throughout it,
Hmm.
and you keep bringing
Hmm.
that up. Like, what is the connection there between soul hungers and being satisfied in God and life in suburbia?
Yeah, I love Jamie Smith, the philosopher, talks about, you are what you love. And another way to think about desire, right, is in terms of hunger. Augustine talks about it in some of that language, and C.S. Lewis as well, is about this inconsolable longing. And I like all that language. It makes
Hmm.
sense to me. And so if we think about the idea of hungers, we realize that our places, they prop us up for certain kinds of hungers, right? Or they try to answer our hungers for belonging and identity and meaning and value and purpose by what they offer. And obviously, those don't actually fit. So, if you think of the parable of the prodigal son, you get two sons, and the first one leaves the place of protection and care. He wants the father's stuff. He doesn't actually want the father. So he goes off and he tries to make a name for himself, like Suburban 101, right? I'm going to go off. I'm going to be isolated. I'm going to make it. Um, and then instead of making it right, he fails utterly, and he's at the end of his rope, and he figures the only way he can actually make sense of his life or just even survive, right, is to go back to his father. And then the older son too, he's done everything right. And that's another version of maybe Suburban
Hmm.
101 where like I followed all the rules and now I get to live my life with my 2.5 children and my white picket fence. So stay away. And so, both of these sons though are trying to meet their hungers for belonging and worth and value apart from the father. And so I think Jesus tells us that parable to say, you know, we're not going to actually ever find our deep satisfaction met unless we're actually clinging to God, unless we are connected to the Father. And some of that's going to come through a lot of pain. And some of it's going to look like getting shut out, like the older son does. But both are welcomed into the feast of the Father at the end. The older son doesn't take it, which is super bummer. But and I think there's a lot of questions for us who try to kind of live the good life on our own
Hmm.
there. But I think, that connects to suburban hungers in the way that is that we often kind of look for the shiny object, just like that younger son. And the challenge is to find rhythms and people and places to root ourselves in that help bring us back to God as our source of ultimate meaning.
Yeah, that's so good. So you actually name some of the big idols
Hmm.
that arguably are more present within a suburban context. And you name consumerism, individualism, busyness, and then safety. Um, I would love for you to talk just a little bit more about those, and maybe
Hmm.
even going like one by one. Like, what would be a simple definition for each one of those? And then how do those things crop up like in our everyday lives? Like, what would that look like for an everyday person in suburbia to say, this is what consumerism might look like in my life, or individualism might look like in my life?
Hmm. Consumerism really says like that I'm only as good or loved or valued or worthwhile as my stuff is what I surround myself with. And so whatever, and you get Instagram who's saying like you need to purchase XYZ and all of these different algorithms that are forcing us into consumptive models. And then we might like run out and be like, great, I bought the new face cream or this great, I don't know, green smoothie thing, and that might work for a bit. And then
Yeah.
and then then there's something else, right? The home gym or like, there's always like something to purchase to kind of try to self-improve, I suppose.
Hmm.
And so I think there's ways in which for consumerism, I write about literatures of or liturgies rather of fasting and feasting. And so
Hmm.
consumerism, right, is like we just keep needing more and more and more. And it's problematic if that never runs out, right? We see the parable of prodigal son, it runs out and it actually changes his behavior.
Yeah.
For those of us who can be like keep switching whatever the object is, um, practicing liturgies, so regular rhythms and storytelling to ourselves and in community of fasting, choosing to deprive ourselves of something, and then feasting. Because, like if you go on a nice vacation and you eat everything all the time, like you feel kind of gross.
Hmm.
But if you're then like, I'm going to eat salads for a week and then go on that vacation, that feels really fantastic. And so we need the same thing for our spiritual lives.
For sure. Yeah, it's so funny. This is kind of a little side note. It's like whenever we do go on vacation, my family and I, we can only eat out like so many times before we're like,
Right.
we actually don't want to eat out again. I
Yeah.
know it's kind of funny you mentioned that. So
Yeah.
what about individualism? Um, because that one is kind of like bred into just American culture in general. Like we're like raised on that. So
Right.
what might that look like in a suburban context?
You get that you want to ask too, like how often do I interact with people that I don't know, right? Or that I don't choose to know. Like in a city, you bump up against people all the time that you're like, that person's different,
Hmm.
and you're in third spaces. In the suburbs, it's really hard to do that often because you can drive your own car to work and be isolated. You can pick everything you want to listen to. You do your thing. You can choose to ignore the weird coworker, and then you can like go right back into your garage. Um, and then choose, I mean, you still have a family, but that we can even isolate ourselves right with our phones as well,
Yeah.
even when we are with our families and with people. So this sense of we think that we're going to find freedom when we're isolated, right? We think we're going to find the good life when we are by ourselves and we can control everything.
Hmm.
And ultimately, God is a community and He's created us for community. And so, though community is hard, it doesn't mean it's actually much better and it's how we were created. And so, if you think about maybe one practical way you could try to combat individualism is, go for a walk and don't put in your AirPods and actually try to engage with passersby. That's a really easy first step.
Hmm.
Or choosing to go to a third place. My husband, when we lived in the suburbs, went to the same pub every week, and most of them were atheists and agnostics, and they thought it was funny that this pastor was there to do his sermon prep. But he
Hmm.
had really great relationships over the course of several years by
Yeah.
just showing up to the same place.
Yeah, that's good. And number three, you said busyness, and you wrote in the book, you said, I believe it was in this chapter, you said,
Mm,
leisure used to be the like status symbol, but
hmm
now, like in suburban cultures, busyness is almost a status symbol. And I've
hmm
noticed that. I've noticed
hmm
that. And I want to see if you could speak to that one as well. It's almost like the busier you are, the more important you are, and the
For sure.
more valuable you are in the community. It's like you are
Exactly.
just
Yeah.
running full bore. What does
Right.
that look like?
Yeah, I mean, you can ask anyone and say like, "How are you doing?" And the answer will always be busy, right? Everyone needs me.
Right.
I'm so important. It's either busy or fine. Like we can't like you would look at someone crazy if you're like, "Oh, I'm having kind of a hard day and things have been slow."
Right.
They'd be like, "Who are
What
you?"
have you been doing all day?
Right. So
Yeah.
we use productivity really as a measure of our worth. We continually treat ourselves like machines, right? And machines are good if they're efficient. And so we treat ourselves like machines. And that's very problematic for finite humans to
Yeah.
begin to use the language of machine. And so if we're thinking about busyness as a status symbol, um, you know, we notice like in the Bible how much Jesus he has really good boundaries, right? He doesn't heal like every person in Galilee. He goes off to pray. He's by himself. Um, he shows up late for things. Like he isn't in this like constant reactive mode and busyness. It just feels like you're always reactive. And so there's a sense in which Jesus, as we see him live out his life, is slower, right? He has a human, he's walking places, right? He doesn't they
Hmm.
don't have cars or jets or airplanes. And so we have to realize too, our technology speeds us up as well. But he has kind of a more of a human pace, and I think we can really learn a lot from that. And you could start by just looking at your calendar. A lot of us have, higher, like have the ability to have higher outputs, but it doesn't mean we don't need, a Sabbath rest, and we need downtimes, and we need times where there is blank space on our calendars.
Hmm. Yeah, and then the final one here you talk about is safety, and I've been thinking about this one more and more. Uh, and maybe for a listener who's like tracking with us and they're like, okay, first one, consumerism, got it, individualism, got it, busyness, got it. You come to safety, and it's a little provocative because
Hmm.
on the one hand, safety is a good thing.
Right.
And so what's the shadow side of safety that you're kind of getting at in the book?
Yeah, I think, what's interesting is I think a lot of people who are tend to be just kind of very natural nurturers can tend to overprotect children or people or themselves, or kind of self isolate to overprotect. Um, and that's not me. So, and I have 4 children, right? So there's no possibility for me to always keep them safe. And ultimately, we know if you're raising children, if you're in deep relationships with other humans, whether or not you're a parent, you cannot keep the people you love safe. And I think really when we think about safety as an idol, it's really about control, right?
Hmm.
We're trying to control outcomes so that we won't have to experience loss and pain. And we can't do that. Right. And we even know when we have a bad day or helping someone else through a bad day, like the way that you get through it is through it. And
Hmm.
so, obviously we don't want to put our children in harm's way. We don't want to be like, great, let's not have a fence, just go play in the street. um, that there are appropriate boundaries and guardrails for our lives. But when we kind of veer, kind of come out, maybe like Jonathan Haidt's The Anxious Generation have talked about the ways that overprotection, and you also get this in Madeline Levine's The Price of Privilege, which is a great book, that the price of privilege is that we are overprotecting our children. And so they never actually have the ability to risk and to fail in those developmental years. And so then they don't actually grow, right? We
Hmm.
know that we do grow through our failures and losses. And to actually become a resilient human, we need to go through those. And so it is a disservice to the people we love to try to control and protect them and keep them safe in an overly invested helicopter parent sort of way.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, I wrote this on some of the notes that I shared with
Mhm.
you, but I don't know what the saying is, but it's almost like, a fish doesn't know it's living in water until it's
Right.
like maybe taken out and then thrown back in. They're like,
Hmm.
"Oh my goodness, like I've been in this stuff my entire life."
Yeah.
Like what might you say to somebody who reads the book or hears this and says, yeah, I see that. I see how that could be a bad thing, but that's not me. Like, that's my neighbor. My neighbor's the
Right.
consumeristic one. Like, I'm not the alcoholic, you are, that kind of thing. Like,
Right.
how do
Right.
you get somebody to really slow down long enough and take an honest look at their life to be able to say, you know what, there may be something there. Like, I might need to investigate that about my heart a little bit. Like, there may be a
Hmm.
consumeristic tendency here, and then whoosh, we're into the conversation. Like, how do you get people to notice the water they're
Yeah.
in?
I mean, I think it only happens in community, and safe and vulnerable community, where people know that they're loved and accepted, even if they're ridiculously consumeristic, or,
Hmm.
they're snow plowing their children. And I was also speaking to someone recently, and she was saying, you have to, in relationships, you wouldn't just give a stranger like $100 bill and be like, hey, keep this for me, okay? Like
Right.
that person has to earn your trust to be given the responsibility of the $100.
Hmm.
And so I think even in some of these conversations, to realize you have to have the depth of relationship and the security of the relationship. And you also have to have the trust, and the longevity, maybe, of a particular relationship to have these sorts of conversations. Because it doesn't do any good just to tell people how consumeristic they are.
Right, right. Well, you said this on page
That
80. Go ahead.
prerequisite. And then, maybe, yeah, you can pick up this book if you want and you have a book club. Um, and say, okay, part of our rules is that you don't get to point the finger at anyone else.
Right, right.
That's off the table.
Well, on page 81, you said this. You said, we have a particular task as suburban Christians. We must dig down past all the fluff to find our souls. We must take away our pet projects and our politics that we think will change the world. We must refrain from endless accumulation and be brave to sit in the quiet right in the center. How does someone get there? Because I think in many ways, like I read the book, and you're really calling the reader to some deep reflection, like some very introspective things. And for somebody who might not be bent that way, how would you help somebody do this? Like how does somebody get
Mm,
there and think through, okay, what are the intentional practices that I need to adopt to help push back against some of this?
hmm.
Like that takes some time, to
It
process
does,
through.
right. Yeah. I mean, it's not going to be like, great, I read the book in a month and now I'm good.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
I think, doing this in community, there's, also the ability to think about spending time with each chapter kind of in journaling,
Hmm.
to be like what bugged me, what rubbed against some of my tendencies. That's a good thing. Practicing, and at the end of every chapter, I do have some practices in the
Yeah.
second half of the book that you can do. So, like, do a calendar audit, actually look through, okay, my month of May is pretty insane. And, for me personally, like, there was two or three kind of travel things for work that my husband and I each have. And I'm like, that's not ideal. But sometimes you can't do, that's just what's required. But you have to then have the inverse where you're able to take some time off, right? And rest and refresh. Um, and so even just looking what are the up and down rhythms of your calendar.
Hmm.
It's also maybe to look at your calendar in terms of how we think of hospitality as the idea of making room. And so, are you making room in your schedule, in your resources, in your time for other people? Or is it just about you and your nuclear family and achieving everything you can? And yes, there are seasons, but if that becomes kind of the tenor of our lives, then we're really not living into the sort of community that God calls us to.
Yeah, I want to go there because at least when I was reading it, I felt like kind of a shift at chapter
Hmm.
5, like the
Hmm.
repentance chapter. And again, it's like the story of the prodigal son keeps coming up, and I see these next chapter headings as like following this story. Like in many ways,
Yeah.
it's like you see repentance in the prodigal son, you see
Hmm.
this lavish like generosity of the father. You see a vulnerability. You see this abiding sense of shalom that he's inviting him
Hmm.
into. And so I know there's a lot there, but maybe you could pick one or two and talk about. You already mentioned hospitality, but maybe zero in on hospitality and maybe the second one, generosity. What does that look like for it to be boots on the ground in the suburb?
Yeah. Well, you're a very perceptive reader. Thanks, Justin. Good job. But I think there is a way in which we can make things like hospitality and generosity and all of the seeking the shalom of your place like feel so big, right? And
Hmm.
that we can't actually do it because, I have to take my kid to soccer practice and I have a job and sometime I have to make dinner, right? And so I think you know, a lot of it, I think we change, our desires can change both. Like, I have this desire within me and in my community for a certain thing. And so I'm going to go change my behavior. Sometimes we have to
Hmm.
actually go from the other direction, change my behavior, change some rhythms and ways that I live life so that my desires change in accordance with that.
Hmm.
And so if we think of hospitality as making room, we can tend to think of it usually, though, in terms of entertaining, right? Like, we got to make this amazing meal from scratch and show off our house and everything has to be clean. And one thing Shauna Nequist said once a long time ago that I keep remembering is she said, what you need to do is just anything that's clutter, you just put it in a laundry basket and you actually keep the laundry basket in the room.
Yeah.
So people aren't like, oh my gosh, their house is so perfect. Right. But it's, your spaces are cleared. And then anything that's sticky, you wipe with baby wipes so there's no sticky surfaces. And then you either are like cooking an onion and garlic or bacon because that just smells so good. And she's like, and then you can order pizza.
Yeah.
And I've just always remembered that because I think we set the bar so high as far as welcoming people, whether it's into our lives or into our physical homes. And it's of course more than just making dinner. Maybe it's choosing to go for an evening walk with your family and to notice the needs that are around you and to learn people's names, right? That's a
Mm,
really easy first step. And then, yeah, having a conversation at the mailboxes with your neighbors and asking them if they've read anything recently or what's their favorite hobby. And then maybe you have a block, something, that's outside your house, right? And then maybe you welcome them into your home,
right.
people that you're connecting with. But to keep the bar pretty low and to work through the stages is a great thing. As far as sorry, go ahead.
No, yeah, you go for it.
Yeah. Yeah. And
You were going
then
to
as
slide into
far
generosity?
I was, yes. So yeah, generosity, I think in the same way that we can think of hospitality as less of like a having people over and it's actually kind of a heart posture, generosity is the same thing. A lot of times we think of generosity as just like giving our money away. And it is part of that. But it is to maybe chronicle like, okay, what are the resources that I have? I have
Mm,
my time, right? I have money, of course. I have kind of a skill set or a character quality that could be useful. Um, I have passions and desires around certain things. And to begin to maybe just do an inventory. What are the things that I have to give? And then how might you show up? Or another way to think about it too is what's already going on? Like what's already going on in my neighborhood? What are the causes and things that people are already interested and involved in? And how could I get involved with my time, my treasure, my talents? And so whether that's your neighborhood or your church or other community organizations, you don't have to start everything either, right? You can just say, you know what? I can show up to this food pantry thing. I can show up to this book club. I can, show up to the PTA meeting, whatever it is that's already going on. I don't have to reinvent the wheel.
yeah. Yeah, you mentioned something. I heard a quote a long time ago. I'm not sure who said it first, but they said, oftentimes we try to think our way into a new way of acting,
Mm,
but
mm-hmm,
they said, sometimes we need to act our way into a new way of thinking.
that's
And
good.
there's a professor, his name is BJ Fogg. I think he wrote a book called Tiny Habits. He's
Uh-huh.
over at Stanford, and he said he sees over and over and over again something that he calls the information action fallacy. That
Mm,
like if we think we just take in all this information, that it will change our lives.
yeah.
And I think that's exactly like what you're getting at. It's like there are these small changes, these small habits that we can put into place that literally will begin to form our heart, form our mind, and get us out of
Hmm.
maybe the box that we were in
Yeah.
and into being people of hospitality, people of welcome, people of
Hmm.
generosity. Um, and I was going to ask you this. I know we're kind of getting close to the end, but you and your family in your church that you guys are a part of, I guess it's been maybe, correct me if I'm wrong, maybe 5 or 6 years since you have been back living in the suburbs, um, or maybe even longer than that.
Yeah. Yeah. I suppose
Um,
longer.
what about the suburbs still frustrates you? And what about the suburbs maybe excites you more than it ever has?
Mhm.
Because I'm sure you've got a different relationship with it now than you had when you first got back, and you're just like, oh goodness, here we are. Um,
Yeah. I think it's easy for me to kind of paint like a whole place or people, right, with a broad brush. And so choosing to find those people that resonate with, the desire to create a neighborly place and to create an open space and a welcome space and not just as like a way to climb some sort of social ladder. And so choosing to focus on the individual rather than the group is a way to maintain some hope
mhm,
um, as much as possible. And I think too to remember compassionately that suffering will always find us.
mhm,
If we live in the suburbs, marriages will fall apart, jobs will be lost, homes will not be places of connection. And even if, we're able to use a lot of suburban resources to kind of push off pain and loss. It's inevitable. Um, and to realize, if you're creating sort of community and places of belonging in suburbia, that when loss invariably finds your neighbor and it finds you, you have people to turn to, and ultimately you can point them to Jesus. And that is a tremendous encouragement wherever we live.
Yeah, for sure. Well, one final question, and then I was going to ask you where listeners can find out more. But let's say somebody listens to this or has read your book and listened to this, and they're like, "Man, I want to do this so bad. Like, I want to really just investigate this more, but I'm scared to death, or I have some major reservations with leaning into hospitality, generosity,
hmm
belonging, shalom, that sort of thing."
hmm
How would you encourage them just here at the end?
Yeah. I think it's always, I learned such great things from my own children. The ways in which I have failed them, it feels like so glaring, right, in my own consciousness often. And, I was too short there and I just kind of ignored them there. And, I can chronicle all of my faults. And yet when I come to my kids and say, gosh, I'm so sorry, that was a really rude tone of voice, they are so quick to accept repentance, right? And to
Mm,
offer love and grace. And it's a reminder that Jesus is the same, that we can come with to him, and he doesn't come to shame us. Like, you should be doing better. You should be better at this by now. And I
that's
think
right.
often that's the voice in our own heads of self-condemnation. And yet he is that father, right? In the parable of the prodigal son, who his son has messed up his life completely. And the father sees his son and runs. He looks a fool to go and meet his son. And so just to remember that as you step into some of these things, you have a father who loves you like that. And so you can be secure and know that you can mess up and you can try and fail and try again, and that any progress is good. So just an encouragement that you have a safe place to come back to.
Great. Thank you. Well, how can we find out more about you and your work? Where could we
Yeah. Well,
go?
yeah. My website is aahales.com. And then I also write on Substack pretty much weekly, and you can subscribe there about things about culture and faith and imagination at aahales.substack.com. So that's probably the easiest place to find me.
Excellent. And I'll link to the stuff in your bio in the show notes as well, so people can look up that for themselves in their own time. But thank you so much for joining us on the Living Sent podcast. I was encouraged. I know people are
Good.
going to be as well. And yeah, thank you again.
Thank you, Justin. It's been a pleasure.
Okay, there was a lot there, and I know you probably need some extra time to process through everything that Ashley spoke about. But let me remind you about a free resource that is available to you, your team, or your church and small group, and that is the episode show notes. It's going to give you more resources, questions, and tools that you can use to go a step further with the content that we discussed today. To download today's show notes, just head over to my website at justinwester.com. Just navigate to the podcast tab, and you could download them there for free. I'd love to hear from you this week, and if you have a topic that you would like for us to cover on this podcast, or maybe you know someone who might contribute to this conversation, reach out to me and we'll touch base. And as always, please remember, you don't have to live sent, you get to. We'll see you next time.